Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
Yes, I stuttered over the intro there. I don't do that
I
very often
forget.
anymore, but I did just now. My whole brain was. But tonight we are recording with one of our absolute favorite guests, Ryan Seidemann. He is back for our second edition of what we have termed, or what we've decided to call, our Death 101 series. So anytime Ryan's on for this stuff, these are questions that he is getting from his students, that he's teaching when it comes to all the death related things, mostly in the United States. But some of these questions this time can pertain to other countries, I think, because they're culturally related. There we
Yeah,
go.
there you
Like,
go.
spit it out. So I was super excited. Actually, like I was telling Ryan before we started recording, when I was reading through this list of questions, there's some really good ones. And some of your students are really putting a lot of thought into death culture, death related things that they had never even considered until you started talking about all of this. So welcome back, Ryan.
Yeah,
Thank you.
always so much
Thanks,
fun.
guys. I always appreciate it. It's always fun.
Yeah. And we
It
appreciate you
never,
squeezing us in. You've been busy lately. So
yeah, I suppose so. Aren't we all, though?
that is true.
Um, yeah. I recognize that mug that you've got there. I think we have one downstairs.
I love
Yeah,
Oh,
this mug.
my wife has that mug. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just
My
saw it
mom
the other
sent
day.
this to me, I think last year for my birthday is when she sent it to me. And I've used it on the podcast ever since because it's the most appropriate one I have. I have some other ones that would probably be okay. But since this has all the different types of artwork and stuff that we find on our old headstones, I love
Yep.
it. It's my favorite. It goes well with our tea and everything. So, why don't we, for our new listeners, Ryan, why don't you tell them a
yeah.
little bit about why we do this series with you, what you're teaching, and then we'll jump into some of these questions your students had asked.
Sure. So yeah, I am teaching death and dying in cross-cultural perspectives. That's the name of the one that I teach at Arizona State University, fully online. And it is based on a class that I teach in person at the University of New Orleans, which is same material, but the anthropology of death and burial. And one of the weekly assignment, aside from the readings and lectures that the students have to endure, they got to listen to me talk for hours on end. Um, they have to think about the week's materials and then submit some amount of discussion, some amount of back and forth. And it's not to the whole class, it's just between them and me. And then, some of them I'll answer through the online system, others I'll pull out. And then at the end of each week, I do a follow-up video that they have to watch for the following week of the prior week's best or, most unique questions.
Right.
And so the questions that I send you guys are pulled from those. And last semester, I had 200 students. So the big classes. The summer is not nearly as big, so these will be shorter lists, but
little bit of a break for you because when you've got 200 students and you have to read through all of their questions and discussion points, yeah. And I'm
yeah.
sure some of them can be a little redundant because out of 200 people, some people are going to say the same thing, but
Yeah, they do, but if they're all hitting on some one thing, and a lot of them do, you can really group the questions with few exceptions.
right.
Then it says to me, okay, I missed something in the lecture or they really all focused on this one part of the lecture. And what really surprises me, I'm now in the third term of teaching this for Arizona State right now, and it surprises me that the questions for each time I teach it are different.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's sparking their imaginations in different ways. And one of the things that I get to see that y'all don't is a lot of the students really engage by sharing their own stories.
Oh,
Uh,
true.
And so I have over the last couple of semesters or terms, it's terms because it's two classes per semester at
Right.
Arizona State. I have had wonderful stories about Lakota Sioux burial
Oh,
practices.
how cool.
Got something the other day on a variation on some Buddhist practices, and a whole range of them on a lot of Christian practices. And then I did an hour and a half chat with one of my students offline about Muslim burial practices, and it was
Oh,
just
cool.
fascinating. And she was just happy to share, and I was
Yeah.
happy to listen. So yeah, that's the cool part of it that I get to see that makes for long posts that I don't send to you guys because it's dense. Uh, but anyway,
Although that is some of the stuff that we would like to actually feature on
Yeah.
the podcast in the future are those different types of burial practices because we don't do them all the same. And depending on your culture and your history and your family background, and there's so many that have there's like the cross-cultural ones too where they're mixing the different cultures as our cultures become more intermixed too, which I always find fascinating. What do you take from one thing and add from the other side of things? So you get to see all of that with your
Hmm.
students, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
it is. It's cool. And I
Yes.
actually got a question on that, the mixing and matching, just this past week. So
Oh,
yeah,
good.
next time.
Yes, we'll save that one. But you did, like I said, when I was reading through this list that you sent from this last term, you had some really cool questions. And one of the ones, so for Memorial Day, we talked about two World War I soldiers specifically who had died in France. Their bodies did get returned to the US eventually, and they are buried here in Colorado. And so one of the questions that somebody had submitted to you says, it seems that it took some years until dead soldiers were returned in World War One. Why did it take multiple years? And we touched very, very briefly on the why of this in that episode. I didn't want to get too much into the politics of the whole thing because I was trying to focus on their personal stories as opposed to the politics of the whole war. Um, so that's the first part of that question. And did they also wait to search for missing bodies, which led to later body returns? So that's the first half of that question. So that all pertains to World War One, and then they went on to ask something about World War Two. But let's focus on the World War One portion of that question first, and then we can
So
go on.
yeah, so that's actually particularly timely since, as we were talking about before we started,
Yes.
um, the family and I just got back from a World War One tour of we went to a lot of cemeteries and battlefields in France and Belgium. And so there are a bunch of answers to that question, and it'll be interesting to see if my answers are consistent with what you guys were saying too. But by and large, it was decided certainly by the British government early on that the process of returning the vast numbers of bodies that were literally and just being there and now I'm reading a book right now about the war in Belgium. Um, Literally were piling up
Yeah.
uh, daily. Um, it was just not at the time viable or
Hmm.
practical for them to ship the bodies home. And in so many cases, they didn't have anything resembling either full bodies or identifiable bodies.
Right.
And that was one of the shocking things that hadn't even occurred to me. Um, we were in a park area in Belgium, and it's a fairly famous area from the war known as Hill 60. And we knew that there had been a lot of activity there. You could see the leftovers of the trenches. You could see shell craters. You could see where they had detonated a bunch of explosives underground. But what didn't occur to me until I was reading a sign on the way out was it said something like, please be mindful of while you're in this place that it is not just a green space and it is not just a battlefield. The whole place is a cemetery.
Yeah.
And, listening just today, I was listening to the book on my way home from work, and the author was talking about how when stuff detonated, they had detonated a bunch of explosives underground, that it buried, hundreds of Germans alive. And I just came home and I was talking to my wife about it. I said, my God, we knew that it was a battlefield when we were there, but it was not practical, especially during World War One, to remove those bodies from
Right.
the battlefield. And because World War One had this stalemate trench warfare with no man's land and so many people dying in that area, the bodies were left in most cases and either blown apart, or in some cases they could be retrieved. But a lot of cases they were buried right there for
Mhm.
expediency. And so the British government did make a positive decision not to bring back um, soldiers, and so they are buried as close as they can be to the battlefields. And then there are these staggering numbers of names of people who were never found.
Right.
And the U.S. government was in a similar situation by and large. And it was an even further distance. I mean, for the British, it was 20
Across
some
the
miles.
ocean. Yeah.
Right. Um, and so the sheer expense of it, and at that time, the cost was going to be on the individual families. If they wanted to bring them back, if they
Right.
wanted them brought back, then they were going to have to fund it themselves.
Oh,
So yeah,
that's
we don't
heartbreaking.
really see this notion of no one left behind that we know today.
Because I
Right.
know we did an internment for someone who died on the USS Oklahoma, and he was buried originally in the punch bowl, but he was not a full body remain. And the granddaughter was told me that at that time during World War II, it was a policy not to return. It was the policy not to return partial remains because they feared that would then um, people it would not that we were all gung ho for the war, but that American people would not back it as much if their family members were coming home literally in pieces.
Right.
Pieces. Yeah.
Well, and though I mean, the one of the things that when I was researching our Memorial Day episode and learning about the bringing the bodies that did get returned, so apparently, and I don't know if the British government did this. I know this is what the US government did, but they did actually send out a survey to American families asking if they were even want, and I forget, it was several thousand surveys, not everybody got one, but saying, do you want them or do you not want them returned? And so the ones that were at the top of the surveys that said, yes, we really want our remains returned, those were the ones they actually made more of an effort to try and get back across the ocean. And I'm going to assume, and I didn't read as far into it, again, I was trying not to get too into the politics of it, but I'm going to assume that those were the ones that they knew they could identify
Hmm.
as opposed to the ones that didn't. Now, of course, the Americans were not over there as long as the British and the Germans, obviously, because we joined the war much later. So I'm assuming it might be a little easier to identify some of the American soldiers versus the British and the German soldiers and the others. And then, of course, I'm assuming for the German soldiers specifically, because we weren't real happy with that country at the time, it was like, we're just going to cover them over and call it a day and say whatever.
Right.
Yeah, it was a stark difference in the landscape there. I mean, what really struck us was that the landscape in that region of northeastern France and southwestern Belgium is just so centered around World War One, something that, like you said, as Americans, we were involved for a short time, and so
Yep.
it's not something that's part of the regular consciousness, and it was over there.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's an out of sight, out of mind component to it. But it was very much just a complete identity of that area. And so there were some German cemeteries that we went to. They were much less frequent.
Mhm.
Um, and in a lot of cases, they were, established by the Germans when they were dug into a specific area, but they did contain a lot of mass burial areas. And whether that was after the fact or, during, and they were just unidentifiable, I don't know. But yeah, by and large, my understanding is that the dead would have been treated with a general reverence,
Right.
regardless of side. But yeah, I don't think that the governments were spending mass amounts of money on fallen enemies to give them the, cemetery per, little hamlet, little village that the Commonwealth soldiers got.
Right. Yeah. Um, and then that leads into the second part of the students' questions. It seems like during World War II, so 20 plus years later, they were more prepared for burials or body storage. So at family request. And then it says, and today it seems burial ceremonies during wartime are much quicker. When did all of that change? When and how did all of that change?
So I'm trying to remember the exact answer I gave the student. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but the rough answer is it's been an evolution.
Yes.
Yeah, there were definitely more soldiers shipped home, soldiers and sailors shipped home from World War II than World War One, like massively more. But there are also these massive national cemeteries that
Mm-hmm.
the United States government maintains in many, many different countries, whether they're in Europe, in the South Pacific, in Asia, depending on what war we're talking about. In my class, I even mentioned the original extra national, so out of the U.S. War cemetery that the United States government maintains is actually Mexico City from the Mexican American War.
Mm,
Um, so, the government's been in the business of that for a long time. But yeah,
right.
it was really, I think, a combination of things. Lessons learned was probably the biggest
Yeah.
thing. There, the it was a different kind of warfare.
Right.
And so, a lot of the bodies were more intact, more identifiable. And there was a recognition given that these folks probably should come home. And that really evolved over time, and which is why today, we are still supporting, we as the government are still supporting um, expeditions to Southeast Asia to look for Korean War dead, Vietnam War dead. Matter of fact, my doctoral advisor has been working with the federal government on Tuskegee Airmen crash
Okay.
sites in
Oh,
Europe.
wow.
And so those are remains that, they had gone missing. They have like oral histories about where the planes went down.
Right.
And so the government's still funding that stuff to try to bring those bodies home.
Oh, wow.
And so that's an ongoing thing, and it has become an incredibly regimented process today. And it is very much a no one left behind situation. And that is, I think, really just technology more than anything. Military service people are required to provide DNA samples as they
Right.
enter now. And after the identification of the Vietnam unknown from Arlington in the 1990s, the U.S. government decided that there would never be any more unknowns. And so, folks, the remains are shipped back very quickly now. And yeah, it's a very regimented process, but it's just because the technology in terms of identification has improved and the transportation has improved.
Mhm.
That too. That makes a big difference.
Well, and
Oh yeah,
hopefully we'll never see Normandy and the
yeah.
D-Day invasion again either, where
Fair
there's so
point
many
too.
lost at.
Yeah, the numbers are so vastly different. And that's good, diminishingly
Yeah.
so. Uh, yeah,
Yeah, they're a
that's a
lot
fair point
smaller
too.
than they once were, fortunately. But And like you said, technology. I was thinking as we were having this discussion, these questions go back to World War One, and that was, our first World War, where so many countries were involved, and we were all trying to figure out what to do with our dead from all the different parts of the world that were involved. But then I was thinking too, we had here like the Revolutionary War, where we were killing off British soldiers. I'm assuming most of those that died here stayed here. Like we didn't ship them back to Britain, and they didn't, try and bury them on soil there.
Right.
And other wars like that. And then the only other conflict that we would have had such mass devastation for in our country would have been the Civil War prior to World War One, which all of those, well, not all of them, the majority of those soldiers were Americans, either from the South or the North. We did have other countries helping us out, but so this would be the first time where we would have thought to even say, let's return our bodies back to their home countries.
Yeah, for sure that. And, it was a similar situation in the American Civil War too. What occurred to me too when we got back is, talking about this idea of the identity of an area being so associated with that event, that years-long war. There are parts of the United States that are just the same with the American Civil War, usually along the Atlantic seaboard, where the battlefields, the majority of them were. And, you see the same treatment there too. I mean, that's what Gettysburg was. It was a battlefield turned cemetery because they couldn't deal with the massive volume. And so, but you're right, and that's one of the questions that the students ask too is, well, why do you start by talking about the Civil War and you don't talk about the Revolutionary War? And my response to that is, well, from an American perspective, those were very localized battles. And, they were the local folks fighting in the local jurisdiction. And when the battle was over, the field cleared and the families came out and gathered their own. Now, you make a good point about the British soldiers. They weren't being shipped home.
They were buried on our soil.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, even during the 1860s, when I think about the fact that we did ship bodies back and forth across the country and we've moved whole cemeteries and stuff, the idea of shipping somebody across an ocean at that point was still probably an idea that was not very comfortable to a lot of people or practical when you think about having to store a body on a ship for a long period of time. But now in our modern age, we fly them home in most cases and they come home on a plane and everything. And it's much easier. There was another question in there that kind of pertains to all of this that was earlier up in the question, but it says, do U.S. military identification tags, dog tags, what we typically call them, originate from the concept of casket plates and coffin plates that were used in the UK? And when did we start using dog tags?
So my response to that was a really clever connection that the student had made, but to my knowledge, there's no connection between them. And as a matter of trivia, I want to say that a variation on the identifying thing that we know today of as dog tags was actually really pioneered by the Germans in World War One, and they had they were in two pieces and they were discs, and a circular disc. Well, a disc is circular. That had a little weak spot in the middle, and they would be broken in half, and they had the same information on either side. One of them to be returned home and one to stay with the body for identification. I believe some of the Allied forces had adopted some variation on that as early as World War One, but I don't think there was regular use. I may be completely wrong. This is my understanding. There wasn't regular use until World War II.
That's what I think I know. Now, if you look at the draft cards from World War One, they do have all the next of kin information and all of that on those old draft cards. But again, if you couldn't, if a body ended up in one of those explosions or a really bad gas attack and, was whatever, you still may not have a way to identify somebody. So even if you had the draft card with all filled out with all that information, it may still have been hard to contact family with the exact information about their loved one who had died overseas. But and
But
I'm
yeah,
assuming we still fill out when like you said, now when they join the military, they give DNA samples, and I'm sure they still have to fill out all of that
oh,
paperwork.
they do. As a matter of fact, I actually had a case that tried to go up to the United States Supreme Court on that when I was working in government on all of that paperwork that gets filled out for military folks. It's called a person authorized to a person. It's a PAD form, person authorized something disposition.
It's
And
the military loves their acronyms
right.
for everything.
And yeah, it's one of the first things you fill out as you're entering the service, and it is to designate not just who your family is, but who has the authority, the legal authority to make decisions about burial or cremation or whatever it is for you. So yeah, it's a very regularized process now.
Which is much better. Sadly, it's one of those things that we've had to perfect over time because we've been involved in so many conflicts. But I'm glad that we've improved it to the point that most families now know what happened, when it happened. And of course, we're notified much sooner now with technology too, so people can make those plans a little easier.
I found the question. I'm sorry. I found the question I think you wanted to ask Ryan.
Oh yeah, go for it, because I was struggling to figure out where it was in the list.
If this is the right question. What is a typical legal compensation and responsibility of graveyards in the event of a natural disaster? Good, that was the right question. Okay. I'm assuming, or we're assuming, they hold little responsibility despite the cost of burial. So I guess, is a cemetery liable if a hurricane comes in and washes somebody out? I'm assuming that's where they were going with the question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a good question, actually. And you made the point earlier that we have a lot of water here in Louisiana, especially with our disasters, and we do. The unfortunate reality, as we're learning, is that with climate change, as we're seeing worse disasters everywhere, it's not just the water that impacts the cemeteries. And one that particularly sticks out for me is during a hurricane in Puerto Rico in 2018, I think, was Maria. It caused a massive cemetery to collapse down a cliffside.
Wow.
And so that wasn't really a water thing. I guess the water had undermined it, but
Right.
it was a whole different kind of mess. So the point to all of that is, if your local area hasn't experienced a cemetery disaster, just wait. They will be coming soon to a cemetery near you. And I say that partially in jest, but partially to say, as you mentioned, Jenny, we had talked about this a long, long time ago, like
I
a
was
few
going to say
years
it was a
ago.
couple years ago now.
So, but we in Louisiana here, we had become one of the real forerunners of how to deal with these things in disasters. And so I say this to anybody listening now, hey, talk to your local legislator. This is something you'll need to get ahead of before it's a problem for you. Anyway, all right, that little PSA done. So, what is the responsibility, legal, financial, of a cemetery when there's a disaster? Again, I can speak to my experience here, and we've seen the full range of cemeteries impacted. Um, Hurricane Ida, nope, wrong storm. Let's back up to 2020. In 2020, Louisiana was hit with three storms, Laura, Delta, and Zeta. And across the three of them, we saw over 3,000 graves that were damaged or destroyed from the storm.
Jeez.
And in Hurricane Zeta, we saw an interesting thing shake out. That one hit New Orleans. The other two hit the other side of the state. And there wasn't a lot of damage. It was not a horrible storm, but it caused the collapse of a whole facing of one of those real famous wall vaults in New Orleans. The name of the cemetery escapes me at the moment, but that cemetery was an SCI property. So, one of well, no, the largest funeral services company in the world.
Right.
Um, And our job with the state at the time was to make sure that everything was taken care of. And when we got St. Vincent de Paul, that's the name of the cemetery. Sorry.
No, it's
Um,
okay. It came to you.
when we got the call that there had been damage there, we immediately reached out to SCI and said, all right, guys, we have gotten word that your cemetery is damaged. Um, you have the ability under the law to deal with this yourself. And they said, yep, this is us. We got it.
That's
And
good.
so that kind of typifies what should happen.
Mhm.
SCI is a massive corporation, so
Yeah.
it's not a surprise. But we at the government didn't have to step in to take care of things because that was part of a for-profit cemetery, and it
Right.
had insurance. They had, their own resources. So what the federal government, who usually funds these operations, requires be dealt with first is insurance. So does the cemetery have responsibility? Um, yes, especially if it's an active cemetery, you would like to think that they would have insurance for disasters. The broad majority of them don't. They are usually operated, by small community groups, churches, what have you. And if it's a church cemetery, it's often not part of their insurance policy. And
Mm,
so they too fall into the uncovered, and I mean that in insurance sense, cemeteries. And there is really no legal responsibility in Louisiana to fix it. If you're not a perpetual care cemetery, then it falls to the families.
Yeah.
And that's the case pretty much around the country
mhm.
in the United States. So if it's perpetual care cemetery, it is on that cemetery to fix the mess.
Right.
Uh, Now, we had one in the Lake Charles area in Hurricane Laura that same year that was a perpetual care cemetery. And we called them up and we said, guys, we know there's damage. We've been in there and documented it. This is on you. You got to fix it. We got it. They didn't got it.
Mm,
Uh, and by the time they came back to us and told us that they didn't have it under control, the feds had already shut off the spigot for that disaster. And so the families were stuck in a perpetual care cemetery situation, having to pay for repairs. And it was a terrible situation. I felt so bad for them, the families. But by and large, the responsibility lies with those families. And so in most cases, these cemeteries that are, run by small organizations, they don't even have a formal legal structure.
right.
That's also
So,
good information to know when you're getting ready to bury a loved one on what,
yep,
if the cemetery
Yeah,
does
like
have perpetual care, if it doesn't, and then what will fall on responsibility will fall on the family member if something, God forbid something like this happens. I mean, that's good information to know.
yeah, it's unfortunate because families believe, well, I've buried them. Now that's the cemetery's problem. And they're not necessarily wrong, and they're not unreasonable in thinking that, but
right.
an awful lot of the time it is not the case. And
Yeah.
they don't learn that until they're stuck with a real problem.
Yeah. And
So,
unfortunately, it's not like homeowners were required to have insurance or something like that. Like you said, they're not cemeteries aren't required to do it. And so if they can't afford it, or they have small, and we know a lot of cemeteries have very
Mhm.
small budgets, and so trying to do the basic maintenance sometimes is all they can afford. Um, and I think about some of the perpetual care funds ones. I mean, there's been plenty of cases where those cemeteries have actually run out of funds with their
Mhm.
perpetual care, depending on, I mean, if they're not actively burying people and stuff, they have no more income coming in. So where does that money come from? And
yeah,
as you pointed out, you can only get help from the federal government for so long after a disaster before they say, okay, that's it. We can't give you any more money.
yeah.
That's where
And,
it goes.
the feds too are really constricting what they will cover.
Right.
They won't cover tombstone damage anymore. They used to. But now it's if you don't have exposed remains or an ejected casket, they're not paying.
Yeah.
Um, so
That makes
that's yeah.
sense though too.
I mean, I get it. It's also really hard to tell a family, I'm sorry that that $15,000 tombstone that you took out a second mortgage for just bit it.
Yeah.
But we can't help you.
Now,
So
can individuals take out insurance policies on their grave
Yeah.
sites? Do you know?
theoretically, I think they can, yeah.
Okay. I didn't know. That's something I've never even considered, but now that you've said it.
And I will add that some homeowners policies
Mhm.
cover the gravesite as well.
Oh, that's good to know.
So
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, check that in your policy.
I remember looking when we went to look at a different company, and I don't want to say names because I don't want to be wrong, but that was one thing. That was one of the first things I looked at. It's like, oh, I'm gonna sign up for you because you do have this. And then so I just found that was very interesting.
Something to
Yeah.
put into your
Mhm.
pre-planning when you're doing all your pre-planning that we've highly encouraged on this show, like pre-plan so that you're not caught by these surprises. And I don't know if for some of those insurance policies, even on the individual level, if it's like, I know we've struggled here in Colorado recently with certain areas of the state where fire danger is prevalent and insurance has gone way up, where some companies have said we're not covering fire damage at all anymore because they keep paying for it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the same thing applies in, the areas where you get a lot of water damage or any of those other things. But definitely something to keep in mind when you are purchasing a plot is what could happen in the case of a natural disaster, which, as you said, we see more of them and they've become more catastrophic in some events than they used to be too. So unless you're a millionaire, which most of us are not,
No.
yeah, insurance is probably a good thing to have one way or another. Leading into this though, because some of the cemeteries that, especially in Louisiana, when you were doing all the restorative work after these disasters, somebody had asked, do bones ever completely decompose? So some of your historic cemeteries pretty old, and has anything ever been discussed to solve the problem of the disruption of the graves from these natural disasters? So that was kind of a two-part question, but the first one was, do the bones ever completely decompose?
And the answer is maybe. Um, and again, I don't really mean that facetiously, but it's
No.
hard not to smile because it's a non-answer.
Mm-hmm.
But the real answer is that it depends, and it depends on so many factors. But most of it has to do with the local environment and the context in which the remains are. And so, for example, when I was in my early 20s, my archaeological field school was in North Florida. I was at Florida State, and we were working on a Spanish mission site.
Oh, wow.
And we knew, based on historic records, that the end date of that mission was 1702. It did not survive past that. And at the time, it was common practice to bury parishioners underneath the floorboards of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the excavations got down to those levels, we could absolutely see the outlines of the graves, of the shafts, the discoloration in soil where the shafts had been dug.
Right.
But the pH of the soil, it wasn't even soil, it was like red Georgia clay. Um, was such that the bone just did not hold up. So there was no bone left,
Hmm.
but there were teeth. And so teeth do tend to survive the longest. That enamel really does stay intact. It's intact. It's resilient.
Right.
But the bone is susceptible to break, and teeth will break down as well. Just it takes a lot longer. But bone is susceptible to an awful lot of environmental factors. Sometimes water will preserve bone. I've worked with sites that have done that, have had, beautiful preservation of bone
Wow.
over thousands of years because they were in a wet environment. I've also worked with more sites that you've got kind of a groundwater, wetting, drying over the years, and it just breaks the bone down into this mealy kind of sand mush, and it doesn't do well. Um, but then I suppose the other caveat to that is, so the answer is yes, bone can break down to nothing at all. And it really becomes a dust to dust scenario, right? But the caveat to that is if you have a trained eye, you may not be able to find the remains. But I'd say 95% of the time, you will be able to see that somebody was buried there based
Mhm.
upon soil color changes and things like that.
Right.
Um, so, so yeah, I mean, you can see that there's something there, but in most cases, bone does stick around for a good while. Broken down to its basic chemistry, it's ultimately not organic, so it'll stick around and it can even fossilize. It doesn't happen often, but it can.
Well, I mean, you think about like even cremation, there's usually bone fragments left in those
Mhm.
cremains.
Absolutely.
And they burn it at incredibly high temperatures, but you still have some of that left over as part of what broke it
Process.
down.
Mhm.
Most
Yeah.
of the body is gone, but you still can find those bone fragments in there.
Yep.
Um, yeah. So then the second part of that question was, has anything ever been discussed? And again, at least in the United States, this kind of goes state to state because it depends on what
Yeah.
the states are thinking about their cemeteries and burial grounds. Has anything ever been discussed to solve the problem of the disruption of graves from natural disasters?
It has been discussed and discussed and discussed. And it's not just here in the deep south where we got a lot of water. But it's been other places too. And it's kind of like that quote from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way.
Mhm.
There's almost no way to protect against this. We
Right.
have seen people here, as I'm sure most of the folks that listen to y'all's podcast know, in Louisiana, there are a lot of above ground burials. And let's just knock out right out of the gate, that has nothing to do with our water table. It's all about cultural
Yep.
tradition. But that fact that they are exposed to from the ground, there's something above ground, makes it easier for them to get disrupted. I
Right.
say that because we look around the country to see what other kinds of problems happen to cemeteries, and we find that people that are fully buried underground can also get, blasted out by floodwaters that jump a bank or something like that. We've seen
Mm-hmm.
that in New England. So being buried in ground is not always an insurance policy against a disruption, but it does help. And in 2016, we had a massive flood in South central Louisiana. So not coastal flooding. This was just a rain cloud that came here and just sat over us for days, dumped and dumped and dumped. And several of the smaller rivers did overflow their banks. We had 800 plus graves that were damaged, and a lot of folks floated out of their burial places. And one of the parishes here, the equivalent of counties everywhere else, decided they've had enough of this. They're not dealing with floating caskets anymore.
I don't
And
necessarily blame them.
oh, and we were very happy to hear this because they came up with a solution. And their solution was, all right, everybody in this parish, you will, from this point forward, you will bury everybody all the way in the ground.
No more
And
above ground burials.
no more above ground burials. And, for those of us who were dealing with the wrangling of all of this, that sounded like a godsend. And we knew it wasn't going to fix what had come before, but
Right.
certainly going forward, we wouldn't have another problem. So the parish council, county council or whatever it is, Sorry, I've spent almost all my life in
No,
Louisiana. I don't know what.
I'm good with it. Yeah, for our listeners outside of Louisiana, they have parishes as opposed
Yeah,
to counties, but it's the similar
same
setup.
thing. Yeah. Um, so the parish council said, we're done with this, and they passed a law that said no more burials above ground from this day forward. This is the law. And you know how long that law lasted?
Uh-oh.
1 month. One
Oh,
month until the next council
Oh,
meeting. There was such public uproar about how their customs were being, infringed. And so that went out the window. It was voted down the next month.
wow.
But at the end of the day, maybe it's only delaying the inevitable because, like I said, nature finds a way.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
but the ones that are buried fully underground, if you've got a water event, you're gonna stay put for longer at least. And we do see people putting sandbags on top of the ones that are exposed above, and it does seem to work. I mean, you just reach a critical mass of weight on top of these things, and it'll stop floodwaters. But storm surge is a whole different
Yeah.
ballgame.
Oh, yeah. We I, we don't usually have flooding issues. We do have some flooding issues in Colorado, and there have been some here and there, but our bigger fear is usually fire, erosion, that kind of thing because of our drier landscape. But I will say we have had some issues with flash flooding. We do have several, technically, we have several cemeteries in our state that are completely underwater because we've created reservoirs. And those
Yeah.
cemeteries, they moved the bodies they could, or the families wanted to move, but they're still underwater now. So, and that's just a fact of living in a state where water is very precious to us, and you have to think about, and that becomes a case of the living versus the dead, like whose priorities
Hmm.
take more precedence, who needs it more. Um,
And that's a planning struggle that I have dealt with for my whole career, and I don't know the answer to it. Because there are a lot of people that say, they're dead. We
mhm.
don't
Yeah.
care. But the Colorado situation is an interesting one because you guys kind of can have the dual problem of the fires will decimate the overgrowth and
Yep.
especially the root structures of things that are holding the ground in place, which is where y'all get your erosion from.
Yep.
And we had a call years ago from New Mexico where they had a fire and then a flash flood, and all of a sudden they had floating caskets of people that had been fully buried in the ground. And it was
Yep.
because the fire had decimated that root structure. And then here came the scouring waters, and out
And
they
washed it
came.
all away. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we
So
also
good
have a
luck.
lot, I think, maybe in the Southwest, so not just Colorado, but I would think Arizona, New Mexico, and maybe even parts of Utah, where some of our cemeteries are closer to cliff edges. So as that erosion over time, again, you get a landslide, and just like
Yep.
the one you were talking about earlier, it's just going to wash it out because
Yeah.
there's nothing left to hold it up anymore. So you have to worry about your cemeteries coming in. And
Yeah.
usually in that case, those are usually our more historic cemeteries that aren't actually actively receiving burials anymore. But it is something we'd have to worry about losing. That
Yep.
again, I don't think people think of until it happens because it's not
Exactly.
at the forefront of our brains to think about what's going to happen to the cemetery in the case of a disaster.
Right.
Because when we think about in the case of a disaster, we're thinking about what's going to happen to our living people and our structures and our commerce and all the things that we have to think about because we're alive. The very last thing we're going to think about is the cemetery, unfortunately, sadly, but it is something we do have to consider.
Yeah, no, that's reality. And
Yeah.
that's what we always tell people when the disaster strikes and we get activated. The first question is, are the living taken care of?
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to divert resources
Right.
until those folks are safe and whatever. So we will delay searches, we'll delay overflights and things like that when we know that the helicopters, for example, are being used for search and rescue. We're
Right.
not, we'll just sit back and, watch, wait
Yeah.
for them to be recovered and rescued. And so, yeah, but there is, and so when you're in a disaster situation, it's absolutely easy to, and you should prioritize the living over the dead.
Right.
Then it becomes much more complex in, we want to repurpose this land, and what do we do with it now? Uh, that's the living versus dead problem that gives me headaches every day.
I bet.
There were a couple of questions regarding disposition of remains or finding of remains. So one question was, is it required by law for family to claim their dead family members? And the second was, what would happen if you happen to buy a house and there is an urn of cremains sitting in the house for whatever reason? It could have been put someplace, say somebody passed away and they cleaned out the house, they missed
They left
something.
it in the attic. They left it in the basement.
Yeah.
You know.
Left it in the oven. Who knows?
It
Can't see
happens.
the oven.
And so I've had calls, working for the government related to death care stuff. I've had these calls, like actual, not just questions from students, but real things, not hypotheticals. So the answer to the first question, is it required by law for you to claim and deal with disposition of your loved one's remains? And the unfortunate reality is that it's not. And part of that reality takes into account the fact that there are an awful lot of people that can't afford even a simple burial or a simple cremation.
Right.
You'd like to think that people would be able to take that responsibility, but sometimes they just financially can't. To my knowledge, every jurisdiction in the United States has a fallback provision that allows either the medical examiner or the coroner, whichever the case may be, to make a judgment call eventually. After family has been notified or due diligence has been done and no family can be found, that they can then make the disposition decision. Historically, they would have arrangements with local cemeteries where they would have an area that was designated as the Potter's Field, and they would bury them there. New Orleans, where I did a lot of work, had a massive field that was behind an existing cemetery where the coroner would bury them in batches. But now a lot of the jurisdictions have cremation authority.
Yeah.
So after a certain amount of time, they can take the remains and have them cremated. And cremation in every jurisdiction that I'm aware of is final disposition.
Mm-hmm.
So then if the decision is to, scatter them in a forest or at sea or something, then that whoever can make that judgment call. The coroners don't have to retain those remains. So what was the other question, Dianne? I forgot.
Oh, if you happen to find an urn.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah. If you buy property and you find the urn or even maybe the actual remains, it has happened.
So, well, there are two different questions there. So the urn situation, which is the more likely, more common.
Somebody accidentally left the urn behind.
And, a lot of times it won't even be an urn. It'll be a box that has a plastic bag in it. The bag has the cremated remains in it. And the answer is you have no legal obligation at all. If you want to scatter them in the garden, go to. If you want to scatter them at sea, go to. If you want to scatter them into your garbage can, unfortunately, that is lawful. Final disposition has been legally accomplished. Is that what I would recommend? No. As a practical matter, you'd like to assume that there would be a name somewhere associated with it.
Right.
And, maybe it's the folks you bought the house from. You say, hey, you left Grandpa here. When can I deliver him?
Yeah.
But again, they don't have any obligation to take them.
And you can mail Grandpa through the mail that way. I mean, you have to fill out a special form, but it is allowable. So
it is. Yeah. And you might want to request a return receipt on that.
Yes.
And I actually, I've seen some lawsuits over that. So it does.
Well, that's a good idea.
Yeah, there was one about 10 years ago that I had it was one of the courier services, I can't remember which one, left it, did not get a signature, and a porch pirate stole the box.
Oh no.
Yeah,
I bet that was a
um,
surprise porch pirate.
probably. Um, but yeah, so always get that return receipt. But yeah, the unfortunate reality is there's no obligation to do anything with them. I try to do my due diligence and hunt down the family and try to get them to make a decision. But ultimately, I think do the best that you can do in terms of what as the landowner then think is the appropriate disposition for those cremated remains if you can't find any.
Yeah.
If you find actual remains like bones and such, call the cops. That's the real short answer. And because the laws on disposition are different if you have physical remains in a non-cremated state versus cremated remains.
Right.
And so every jurisdiction in the US that I'm aware of requires the law enforcement to be called and for a coroner to come out or a medical examiner to come out and make a judgment call. Are these evidence of foul play, even if you can see that it's got, hand scribbled notes on it about where muscle attachments are and screws from being, an anatomized skeleton or something. Still got to give law enforcement the first crack, and 9 times out of 10, they turn it over to the local historic society or archaeologist, and then it's unfortunately on them to figure out what to do. But yeah, whole bone, real bone. Yeah, call cops. Call the cops.
Yeah. I think we've said that before too from other episodes when we've talked about. I don't think that happens nearly as often as the cremain situation
Right.
where, like you said, it's a box that gets left in the closet or left on a shelf somewhere. It got relegated to the basement at some point and somebody didn't realize that they left it behind. But or I mean, there could be the cases where they didn't care anymore. Like I can see
Yeah.
that happening too in some cases. So we'll do one more question that I thought was interesting for this round. And then, of course, we'll have another Death 101 episode soon. But
Good.
the other question that I thought that kind of goes along with all of this, as far as like handling these major disasters, trying to track down all the people and do all the things, but they were asking, does this ever take a toll on those people that are having to do this? And how do you compensate for the mental health side of things with all of that? Because it's a lot.
It is. I can say from having worked disasters now for a long time. We'll go with a long time. Uh, I will say that when Katrina hit, I was not doing human remains. Though that was my specialty, I was dealing with debris. Um, but with the next one in 2008 is when I started dealing with human remains issues. And so I've been around it now for what, more than 15 years.
Yeah.
Um, it's not dealing with the dislodging, the disruptions, whatever you want to call it, dealing with the remains day to day. It has no effect on me, but I think that there's a reason. I think it's because these folks were already dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not on the teams that deal with the ones who die as a result of a disaster. Now, when I worked for the state and ran the task force here, one of our team members was DMORT individual. So he worked for the federal government in disaster, mass fatality, really events to recover remains, identify them, and work with families. He worked 9/11, and he said that, yeah, the toll that it took, not just on him. He said, he was a funeral director by trade. He didn't realize really, I guess, what he had held at bay until a long time after he came back.
I bet.
And then, kind of had a breakdown. But a lot of folks were having them on site, and there was a lot of support, as I understand it,
Good.
for that event on site after the fact. For those of us that deal with the folks that are already dead, there's no mechanism. I gotta say, I really have had the honor of working with a resilient as hell team. We deal with, folks that died a long time ago, day in and day out. The most difficult and challenging part of that job is interfacing with the descendants, with the family. And I, we don't have any resources for that. It's not in the budgets. It's not in the plans. And what I have taken to doing is I know that I can't handle grieving people. Despite the fact that I deal with dead people all the time, I don't know what to do with somebody when they're grieving. And so this team member of ours, who's a funeral director, that's what his training's for. And so, the second the family walks on site, I make tracks and get out of the way and hand them off to him. So then, and I say that I don't, there's a layer
Right.
between me and that grieving. But then again, there's sometimes you just can't escape it. There are that many people that have been impacted, and it's difficult. But it's not something that my team has ever, said we need help or exhibited any signs of that. But like I said, we don't do mass fatalities. In that scenario, I can't even imagine. And usually, yes, there is support for those folks.
Mhm.
Well, and I can think of, like you went into archaeology knowing you were going to deal with the bones of dead people and the remains of dead people that have been dead for a long time, not just a couple of months or whatever. So, that puts you in a completely different mindset than the ones who are dealing with somebody who just died. Yeah. And that's
and it's and sometimes that's to our detriment because it is very clinical for us. And so it's hard for us to turn the switch and be empathetic to the family members because we just don't deal with it in that context.
Right.
That's where you have somebody on your team who is.
And then you say, thanks.
Absolutely.
We'll let you do this. Well, Ryan, this has been such a fascinating discussion. As
Yeah.
always, I love this. I love that your students come up with these things. Again, some of it's stuff that we've talked about before on the podcast or with each other. But some of this is stuff that even with all the talking about death and cemeteries and everything, there are some of these things that I guess I just never even really thought about it, or it's like just a passing thought, or the longer you deal with this stuff and the longer we study it and are part of it, like it's not really a question to us anymore because we just know that it's there and that this is how things are done. But it's kind of nice to be able to offer it to the people that don't have these thoughts on a regular basis. So yes. So thanks again, Ryan. We'll have you back after your next term with some new questions. I love having this segment like this. I look forward to this segment now when you first proposed the idea, I was like, this is great. But I was really looking forward to it today. After I had read through the questions when you sent them, I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear what Ryan's going to say for the answers.
Yeah, exactly. I was like,
I never know what I'm going to say either, actually. So.
Well, I think it's great. So thanks again. And folks, we will be back next week. We have brand new guests joining us for next week's episode that have never been on before. So that'll be fun. And we look forward to that. So thanks again, Ryan.
Thanks, guys. It's always fun.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.